I'm a novelist and memoirist, and most importantly, fan of this incredible book. This unbelievably is Sacha Coward's debut book, but if you have read it, you will know what an incredible feat that is. And if you haven't read it, you have a real treat ahead of you. So, I have so many things to ask about, but don't worry, you also will have time to ask questions, so you can be thinking of them as we chat. But, Sacha, can you get us started and just introduce us to Queen's book?
Well, I was just going to say, you were saying you loved the book. It'd be really awkward if you were like, I hated it. That would be a really tense hour.
I was forced to read this.
Again, I'm just going to say this is, I know I've come to a few places and spoken about this book. It's totally overwhelming to see all of you in like a really lovely way, but thank you so much for coming. See, Queer as Folklore was like my weird hyper-focus made into a book. I used to work at the National Maritime Museum in London, which is one of the few places where if you see mermaids everywhere, people don't think you're hallucinating. And so since childhood, I've been fascinated with myths and monsters. And as a queer person, I've discovered I'm not alone in that. I think I'm looking at the audience here, I'm imagining that's why you're here. So the connection there, I became that person, if you can picture the meme of the person that stood there with a cigarette in one hand, pointing all the string everywhere. So there's loads of pictures of Aboriginal mermaids and unicorns. That was my brain space. And then luckily, this sort of became an idea. I tripped over and found an agent, and then someone wanted to help me write a book, and then this is the weird child that we birthed. That's a really horrible advertising for my book. Please buy my book.
Buy my weird child. Well, I'm actually going to start right at the start with this book. Or unless you want to start us off with a reading, actually, that'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Well, I was going to try and do like a little like local reading. So like as we're in beautiful Edinburgh, I thought I'd do like a little taster from Scotland. And I'm just going to remark that there is a piece that is written in phonetic Scots. I don't want you to kill me. So I'm going to try to anglicise it, and it's going to sound really awkward, all right? So we're just going to understand that the point where I pause and I look a bit awkward, that's what's happening here. So this is the start on the chapter on witches, something that I think, you know, from a queer perspective has become surprisingly contentious. And the chapter's called Witch Hunts. In September 1649, the village of Kilbarchan in the central Scottish lowlands was rocked by a bizarre scandal involving Maud Galt and her servant Agnes Mitchell. Maud and her husband John Dickey had lived in the village for many years. It was a God-fearing village, famous largely for its accomplished weavers and named after the chapel devoted to its very own patron saint, Barchan. Other than census records, they pass unrecorded until an official meeting of the Church of Scotland in Kilbarchan. Agnes Mitchell broke the solemn silence to make a shocking accusation of her mistress. And I need you to picture this, because this isn't like a church, right? And this is the 1600s. She announced that Maud was, awkward pause, abusing one of her servants with a piece of clay formed like the secret member of a man. Simply put, Agnes said her mistress was using a clay dildo on one of her own servants, another woman. It was then revealed that the servant in question was in fact Agnes herself. She had simply been worried about admitting her identity as the victim for fear of recrimination. Agnes next revealed to the no doubt, sorry, I'm laughing at my own writing, it's so good, to the no doubt startled audience, the actual clay penis that she said Maud had used on her. Can you just picture that, sorry? Which she had brought with her to the church. This.
I just wonder where she pulled, like, was it in her dress? In a little bag? Or where was it?
I don't know, I would like the idea of her like ferreting around in a little satchel for it for a while. Right. Yeah, so so it's brought with her to the church. The claim was even backed up by other witnesses who said they'd seen Maud arguing with Agnes. They posited that this might have been her desire to share the story publicly. In much of Scotland at the time, there was a terrible suspicion around deviant and heretical behaviour, actively whipped up by the church. Neighbours were encouraged to spy on each other, and entire communities would quickly turn on whoever was deemed an outsider, as soon as the wind of accusation seemed to be blowing their way. It is perhaps unsurprising then that further rumours appeared, whether or not the sharing them actually believed what they said or simply wanted to join in with the pylon, because being cancelled is as old as time itself. Aspersions were cast on Maud's character in general. She was believed to have a fiery temper and was seemingly not well liked by some of the community. Some suggested that strange misfortunes had occurred to them after angering Maud and blamed her for these incidents. It was implied that they were not just strange but uncanny, supernatural even. The story of Maud using a dildo to penetrate another woman was swiftly combined with this revelation, the narrative now being that this was all part of her use of vengeful, dark magic against her enemies. The dildo was clearly evidence of something otherworldly. The story of the clay penis would therefore fan the flames of what would become an accusation not of lesbianism or even assault, but of witchcraft. Because of course, clay penis equals witch, right? Very obviously. But yeah, there you go. That's my little Scottish reference. You're welcome, clay penis.
Oh, I love it. Okay, we've got so much to dig into with deviant sexuality, and we'll come back to Maud and her penis. There's actually a lot of dildos in this book. That's not where I'm going to start with.
My mother is in the first grade.
I'm sure she's familiar with it, don't worry about it. I'm going to bring us right back to the start of the book. And I'm going to take us to the dedication. This book is dedicated to every person who has ever walked around a museum and wondered if they belong there. So, you do have a background in museums and archives, so I would just like to start with a general question around, do museums need to be queered, and how?
Again, it'd be really, really awkward if I was like, no. So, again, that was a really personal message, and it means a lot to me to get to talk about this book and get to write this book, because I was one of those kids that really loved old stuff. As my mum might remember, I would sneak downstairs when they had like adult friends over, so I could lecture the adult friends on Greek mythology or like draw monsters. That was the kind of precocious child I was. And so museums have always, well, they felt like a safe space, particularly for a kid that felt a bit like a weirdo. But then when I became a teenager, I didn't have the words for this yet. I didn't know I was gay. I knew there was, I wasn't like one of the other boys. There was that classic realization. But I started to see that I loved the museums, but they didn't love me back. And I would go there, and I would not see stories like myself represented. I wouldn't see the kind of relationships, me lusting after Harry Appleby on Sports Day. That wasn't in the ancient Greek kind of gallery, which is really funny if you know anything about ancient Greece. So yeah, I think there was this, I went to work in museums not because I wanted to be like a radical Daily Mail baiting queer activist. I went there because I liked old stuff and I liked mythology and folklore, but when I was there, as many queer people who find themselves in any position of like tiny insignificant power, you kind of feel like, well, if I don't do this, who is going to? I think a lot of us find us becoming the LGBTQ plus representative in whatever group they're in. And so, yeah, I realised that there was a missing part to the human story. And as many queer historians, many people who are LGBTQ plus working in museums have also realised. And so it felt profoundly important to talk back to that 13-year-old at the British Museum who felt completely lost and terrified. Because the conclusion that you come to is, this is a museum of the human story. I'm not in it, so I'm not fully human. No 13-year-old should have to think that about themselves. So, yeah, museums, if we really want to drill down into it, museums, they tell stories. They're receptacles of history. They're places where we put all the things we want to remember, all the things we need to remember. And anything you miss out of that, you're basically saying it's not important, it doesn't exist, it's not real. So queer stories in museums is vital because we've always fucking been there. We always will. And if you're not doing that, then museums are doing bad history. And as a kind of boring academic, if you're missing out the queer stuff, you're doing bad history, and it's not good enough. Ooh, little soapbox moment there, sorry.
That was good. Somebody tweet that. You do talk a lot about history, you describe history as a living beast, and I was really fascinated by that. And obviously this book focuses on folklore, but as we have Joanne Harris in the introduction, she talks about history is, because it's all stories, right? History is all stories. The history that we think of as fact is the version that's written by the people. The story that's the one written by the common people, which I'm going to say is myself, and I don't want to speak for anyone else in here, but probably most of us are the common people. That's folklore. That's the stories that the common people told. So it's not that there is history which is a fact and true and can be proven, and there's folklore which is fully made up and has no connection to reality. There's this very, I would say, queer intermingling of the two.
So I think the thing is that I don't want to get too far into queer metaphysics, as fun as that is, get me a drink afterwards, but like something really did happen. So if we're talking about any historical moments, like something happened, it did happen. There was almost certainly someone called Henry VIII, and he almost certainly had so and so many wives, and these things happened. But the records that we build history from, they're not by getting in a time machine and going back there and actually experiencing it. They're written, they're stories, they're accounts. So every part of history, whilst one of the goals of a historian is to try to head towards accuracy, to not make things up, to not create fiction, it is really difficult to ever say, like, this is written in stone, even when it is written in stone, literally. Because history is just the stories people tell about history. And if you're a good historian, you get into historiography, you're talking about who gets to tell those stories. Why are those stories told? Who's writing them down? How are those recorded? So it does amuse me that if you go online at the moment, you'll find that there are a lot of particularly sort of right-wing men who will position themselves as like, I'm Mr. History, I'm Mr. Facts, I love classical history, facts don't care about your feelings, which is really bizarre because you've chosen history, bro. And that is so like ephemeral and messy and human and depends on your account. I mean, even the most respectable historians, they don't all agree with each other because we're all coming to different conclusions. We're all looking at a set of points and then coming to a conclusion. That doesn't mean we just make stuff up. That doesn't mean, because that has no power, that has no strength. But history itself is not a set of facts. It's kind of using the resources that we have to try to get somewhere. In terms of folklore, though, God, that's even messier. Because folklore is literally the stuff that more or less isn't true, or is it? Sometimes it's based on true stuff. Was there a King Arthur? Probably not. Was it based on someone? Maybe. It gets really murky and messy. And if I'm going to be really sort of pretentious, really queer in that fact, because you can't pin anything down, because it's based on oral tradition, on the stories that people tell. And I think it's such an exciting space because of that, but also such a powerful space. Think of all the stories you were raised with, and like the impact that has on you today is just enormous. So yeah, it's become somewhere that I'm so fascinated with. It's such a wonderful playground, a wonderful dark playground.
I like that wonderful dark playground. That's beautiful.
Swear against that nightclub.
So I had to try and be quite strict with myself because I feel like this could be a 5-hour event with all the things that I would love to dig into in this book. So I have restricted myself to one question per section, which even then, there's a lot of information in this book, so even we might not get to the end of that. But I'm going to start at the start with mermaids, which is your first chapter. And here we go. How exciting is I? On the very first page, we have the Disney version of The Little Mermaid, and we have Ursula, my personal sexual awakening. Very confusing to me as a child. I would say also probably Robin Hood, like being quite intrigued by both Robin Hood and Maid Marian. It's only now that I'm like, they are foxes, but...
I wonder why like the furry community is like so big.
How did that happen? And I was really fascinated because I think Ursula more so the sexual awakening because she was quite frightening, but like sexy.
Yeah.
And that interesting conflict, and it made me think so much about mythical creatures and queerness, and I love the section about the mermaid, which is a mix of a human and a fish, or a siren, which is a mixture of a human and a bird. And I didn't notice, I might have missed it, but I didn't see a mention of a selkie, which is a Scottish, I'm sure you did look into selkies, but I mean there's so much that you couldn't include in here. And a selkie, as I'm sure you know, is a Scottish mythical creature. But what fascinates me about the selkie and why it's the creature that I, as a bisexual cis woman, most connect with is because when the selkie is a seal, it's fully a seal and appears just like any other seal, and when it's human, it appears human just like any other human, and I really connected with that. It seemed to say a lot about bisexual identity. So, well, my simplistic question is, which mythical creature do you connect with? And my larger question is, why do we as queer people connect with these mythical creatures in this way?
So like selkies, so that there are creatures that are underrepresented in this book, not because they're not queer, but just because I couldn't find that like strong inroad. So like selkies were one, goblins, there's not enough goblins in my book, and not enough dragons in my book. Please buy my book. But like, yeah, so I understand like that there's really interesting things here, because you've got one side is what are the creatures that we sort of project and connect with. I've never heard a selkie described so beautifully as a bisexual metaphor. That's fascinating. I love that. I'm stealing it. It's mine. It's like Ursula with the voice. So unsurprisingly, I'm wearing a bloody mermaid on my t-shirt. I love mermaids, but I really like dark. mermaids. So I loved the Disney film. I used to watch it frequently before going to school. But the scene that I would watch over and over again, like you, was Ursula. But as like a young gay boy that didn't know he was gay, there was like a different kind of connection going on. It wasn't necessarily that I was attracted to her, but I was just like entranced by her. And the fact that she was breaking the rules of the film. Because in the film, like pretty much everyone else, unless they're like a comic character, is just pretty, like very just standard, thin, white, that's how they're depicted. And she's this kind of completely different colour palette, different movements, different character, different voice, and it's just so much more compelling, I think, even as a young person. So I found like that really entrancing. I thought that she was fascinating, and later that she's a drag queen, because she literally is a drag queen. She's based upon a drag queen, and that's why her movements. You start the film with her putting lipstick on in the mirror. Like there's a whole scene that's cabaret. But in terms of mermaids, I think I love that duality of the fact that they are these beautiful sirens, but they will eat you, right? And they will spit your bones out and make their home out of it. I love that.
And you'll love it too.
You'll love it, you'll love it, yeah. But also like the idea of like, there is this idea of like the Fiji mermaid, these hideous homunculi, fetal-looking creatures that drag themselves across the floor that are made by Japanese fishermen based on the Japanese folklore of the Ningyo. So monstrous mermaids, the fact that you've got monster and beauty sitting so close together. And if I'm honest, if we're talking about sort of sexual awakening, I'm not going to go really deep on this, I promise. My mum is in the front of the audience, just remind me. So it's the idea that as queer people, you know, one of the first times we come across the human form in a sort of, you know, we know what we're supposed to like because we're very early taught what boys like and what girls like. But mermaids are where you see topless men and women. So the women often have clamshells, but you know, they're there, they're visible. So it's almost like a pre-sexual experience. I remember Little Mermaid, and I remember the buff mermen swimming towards the castle. And my God, I remember Poseidon. But we all have these moments, and the reasons we're all of us, however, wherever you feel on the gender or sexual spectrum, a lot of us have these moments with mermaids because naked human forms are often seen as like not appropriate for children and dangerous and strange. But mermaids are cute and safe. So they're like a safe space for you to go, okay, I think I like that. I don't know why, I'm just kind of drawn to it. And then the other side is most mermaids or merfolk, you know, the cut-off point is just below the waist. So genitalia doesn't come into play. No one asks, like, Ariel, define a woman, or what are your pronouns, right? She's a woman because she is. No one needs to go and check her chromosomes. So it's something about that, I think, is such a free, playful space for young people, and therefore it's no coincidence that the biggest transgender youth support network is called Mermaids, right? So I think, yeah, mermaids are this interesting space, but don't just spam me with loads of pretty mermaids. I like them dark, all right? Really scary. Scary mermaids are fantastic.
Scary buff mermaids.
Scary buff.
So I love that you brought up this idea of things being appropriate for children, but children maybe not having the reaction that we might think, which leads us on beautifully to part two. Beautiful segue, thank you. Which is unicorns. Now you may know that the unicorn is Scotland's national animal. We are a land of folklore, except I'm always going to think of dildos now, which you'll understand when you read the book. Yeah, it's making me look at my passport very oddly.
Wait till we get onto the unicorn, my God.
We're on the unicorns. So one thing I found so interesting about the way that you speak about unicorns is that they have this history of being feral and dangerous, and not as we might think of them now as these kind of very pretty, glittery, very sanitized. They were seen as kind of sexualized and dangerous, and that they could only be tamed by these virgin girls. Which I find it fascinating that now they are linked with little girls. We think unicorn toys, and it made me think also fairy tales the original versions of fairy tales, very sexualized, very violent, very gory, and now we think of them as being for little girls. Fascinating, and it made me think, God, we put some heavy things on little girls, actually.
God, we do, yeah.
So yeah, well, can you talk a little bit about this, how the unicorn has evolved from this feral place?
Yeah, so the unicorn, like ancient, or the monoceros, they have like different names, but in medieval bestiaries, they're often like, they're like goatish, they're really like feral animals. There's bits of like lion mixed in there sometimes. They breathe fire, they're dangerous and deadly, they will penetrate you. You know, they're frightening creatures, and this kind of becomes a parable around, you know, clearly that's a stand-in for the man, because, sorry to ruin your passport, but unicorn, it's a phallus, right? It's symbolic of a phallus. And so the combination of a young virginal woman, you know, if we're going to be really straightforward about it, it's about feral men are calmed by a good woman. That's kind of one of the narratives that's wrapped up in early unicorn stories. So the images sometimes you get on like medieval tapestry will have like the unicorn and the woman's like cradling the horn, and it's really salacious. Like she's sort of, you know, you can picture it, right?
Well, we are now.
We are all doing it together, aren't we pleased we came tonight? This image of the unicorn, and classically this goes through many permutations, many different symbolisms, and it's the Victorians, because they do a friggin' hatchet job on so many different creatures. The fairies get it really bad as well. We'll be coming to them. And like, so they get basically blitzed up, they get sanitized. And the Victorians really wanted to enjoy monsters and creatures and spirituality, but as a deeply religious and in many ways, but not others, sexually repressed group of people, they would have to like dilute everything so they could still enjoy it. And so the unicorn was already on its way through heraldry, being associated with kings and royalty, becoming big and glamorous and pure with its association with the Bible. And the Victorians just took it the next step. And they sort of overdid it a little bit. Like it became too much pink, a bit too much gold, a bit too colourful. And suddenly, when you do that, it becomes camp. And who are the people that like camp things? Us gays and little girls. Some of the most derided people in society. As soon as like gay men and little girls like something, you can guarantee, firstly the Disney store will step out of it, but also that the rest of society will roll their eyes and say it's gross, right? So that's kind of how unicorns, because they become sanitized, they become a bit too glitzy, a bit too camp, a bit overdone. Who are the people who go, we'll like it anyway, we don't care, you can never have too much pink, little girls and gay, right? Okay, this is the classic thing. So then the weird thing is, it then comes, all of those sexual, the underlayer of sexuality doesn't just go away, it's still there, and it bubbles up in weird moments. So we've tried to create this completely like sanitized symbol, but it still has such queer connections and such sexual connections that it can't be fully sanitized. Which is why we now have it as like, whenever a big company wants to do Pride, but they don't want to actually have to invest in doing any real work, unicorn, right? That's the symbol that we go for. You know, Lady Gaga on the unicorn, yeah, on one side, it says something about you be your freak, do whatever you want, but it sells a lot of records as well, and that's convenient as well. So the unicorn for me is a really divisive queer symbol. I feel bad for that horse because it doesn't deserve it entirely. It's been through like the kind of Victorian measure, but what it's become is like our most palatable symbol, in that it's something that doesn't offend, but at the same time it loses some of its potency. Not to say we can't do some really fun, punky stuff with it and subvert it, and we do, yeah. Complex.
Your segues are on fire, because this leads us seamlessly into fairies, our next chapter. Beautifully done. So, you may know some history of fairy lore, that they were these kind of violently horny, brutal, child-stealing creatures that would come for you in the night, and you weren't to go to the kind of remote areas of the countryside.
It's so funny because when we talk about politics and how we're spoken about today, sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, this is exactly what I would love to talk about, yeah. But now we think of fairies as like little Tinkerbells, cutesy for little girls. It actually made me think about a lot of the depictions of queer men in particular that I saw growing up were in like Sex and the City, Will and Grace, the gay best friend, very sanitized, very sweet. And this comes up a lot on RuPaul's Drag Race, that every now and then they'll say, I know you think that we're these like cute, glam creatures, but like we fuck men. Like, and we kind of desexualized and sanitized gay men. So maybe I'm reaching too far with this connection to fairies, but I'm just always really fascinated when, like the unicorn, like the fairy, something which is an adult thing becomes sanitized.
So one of the things that fascinated me about like researching fairies was, so fairy is quite an outdated slur. Like it's lost a lot of its edge recently. It's a very like 90s, very like 1993 insult used against gay men.
Specific.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's got that flavour to it. Anyone that was born in like 1987, you get my. So it's kind of like your granddad might have used it, but it probably was starting to phase out. But if someone calls a gay man a fairy, you instantly get what's being implied, right? We all know that that's a connection that's being drawn. So I would presume, okay, so fairies are pink and pretty, and you know they're effeminate and they're not real. So ultimately, that's the insult that's being made against gay men. And on one level, yes. But the fascinating thing for me is because the Victorians did the same, kind of went into the Victorian sausage factory, the scary Celtic fairy becomes, you know, has its wings clipped and gets put through a processor and comes out in a tutu. But that is actually how we get the word fairy, because the very, in terms of being used to describe gay men, the very first written incident of the word fairy being used to describe a queer person is written in a piece called Diary of an Androgyne, and it's written in the 19th century, so very end of the 19th century, and it's about a person who describes themselves as Jenny Lind sometimes. We might use the term non-binary or trans or gay, it all gets blended together complicatedly. But they would go to a nightclub called the Priestess Hall in New York and go to a table that was called the Land of Fairy. And this was where all the gay and queer people would hang out and would refer to each other as fairies. So we did it first, like rather than just being a term that was just hurled at us, you're camp, you're glittery, you're stupid, you're gross. It was more something that we saw a connection with and we took it, and then it became an insult that was used. And arguably that was partly because of what the Victorians did. Because they made it sparkly, and particularly they put it into ballet, so much ballet of that time period, it includes fairy characters, Sleeping Beauty, you name it, there's the good fairy, the dark fairy. Who do you think was running the ballet? Who was designing the costumes? Who was performing? Who was in the audience? Like obviously a lot of people, but a high proportion of queer people. And so I believe through that connection, we get this fairy being like a subversive term understood by queer people as being basically fabulous. Like hot men and women dancing around athletic as fairies. It's gonna obviously, you know, I was turned on by, you know, mermaids. Of course they were going to be connecting with this. So I think that's the power of the fairy, is weirdly, the fairy was diluted by the Victorians, but in becoming pretty and powerful and pink, it actually became an even more powerful standard. And to briefly talk about queer women, we also have Peter Pan. So Peter Pan is, you know, basically a fairy boy. His last name Pan comes from the Greek god. He has a fairy friend. He flies. He's a fairy. And mostly he's, well, originally in theatrical performances was always performed by women and by a lot of queer women who would have the opportunity to cross-dress, to have, you know, short hair, which then inspired this Peter Pan style of women, particularly queer women, in like, we're talking the early 1900s, with a particular collar and haircut emulating these kind of these actresses performing as Peter. So the childlike, innocent fairy actually created more space for queerness. So we can almost thank the Victorians because they actually created an even stronger through line for us in that way. So yeah, it's not always that they did a hatchet job. Sometimes they may have almost done us a service.
I loved learning in the book that a Peter Pan collar was like a way to show that you were a queer woman. I really like that because I'm very fond of a Peter Pan collar, I have to say. But again, a perfect segue into our next chapter on werewolves. And you've already mentioned this idea of language being reclaimed, language that perhaps we started something and it was taken and it was twisted. I just want to start because I found such joy in the mention of this transphobic Red Riding Hood cartoon being reclaimed with the term, well, I'll let you tell the story, so can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so the classics of this was, I'm trying to remember which paper it appeared in, but it was an image of Little Red Riding Hood and the werewolf dressed as the grandmother. And I think the quote is something akin to, so you kill grandmother and now you want to get sent to a women's prison. So the term is, trans women are the wolf pretending to be an old lady so that they can kill or eat Red Riding Hood. It's a symbol that's been used against trans people, but also queer people in a whole. The idea of being secret, hiding. It's actually behind the veil. You've got this awful secret. You're just a man in disguise. That thing, which is deeply hurtful and cruel and problematic. But then it was taken to be written as the Werewolf Manifesto. Because the fun thing about language is if you actually take the word were, so werewolf, doesn't mean like changing wolf, it means man-wolf. So if you say were-woman, you're actually not saying, you're saying man-woman. So a were-woman would be, in some senses, if you want to go that way, a trans woman. A trans woman can identify with the idea of being a were-woman. And the idea of this person writing, you know, some people are men, some people are women. Some people find themselves originally as a man, and then something akin to a full moon happens, and a radical transformation takes place. Some of us transform backwards and forwards all the time. And so it's almost taking this symbol, which is often used to hurt queer people, the wolf in disguise, the hideous thing that transforms and hides among us, and going, fine, then we'll be that. But we'll turn it into something empowering and beautiful. So it's really interesting to see how we've used the terminology, twisted it ever so slightly, and created space for queer people where before there may have been hate. So I think that's something we do again and again. We see it with drag queens. We take trash and we turn them into dresses. That's something we've been doing throughout history. Whatever your identity, we'll take the thing that other people don't love, or the thing that someone's thrown at us, and we'll pick it up and sort of turn it into art. And I think that's something glorious about the queer community.
Yeah, thank you. It's so beautiful. So I don't have a segue for this, but you know,
sorry, I think
that's okay. There's such a huge quantity of content here that I can't help but ping pong around because there's so much that I want to ask you about. But we're on our next chapter, which is vampires, which I was very excited to read. So all I have written in my notes is Bram Stoker queer, question mark? Tell us more.
So Bram Stoker is a really interesting character. So when you read a number of his biographies, it's like some of the earlier ones, it's like the author is trying to say everything other than calling him gay. So it's all kind of like, he had a very complex relationship with sexuality. He did all of this stuff that's really evasive. But for me, there is like the letters that he wrote to Walt Whitman, which are incredible, because rarely have I seen something laid out so explicitly queer. The letter starts, again, I'm paraphrasing, please buy the book, read the book. It's basically says something like, if I take you for the man that I think you are, then you will enjoy this letter. But if I am mistaken, please burn this letter and read no further. Like literally, that's the stuff. And then it's like, I bet you would quite like a younger man, right? writing to you and telling you how much he enjoys the words you speak. This is a writer who's openly speaking about homosexuality, right? How the words you speak, even in times that are deaf to the things that you're saying. I mean, there's not much more of a confession that you can get to. Now, what some people then point to is Bram Stoker was also an incredible homophobe. Because at one point he basically wrote this whole tirade about how Gothic literature was being invaded by sodomites. But we've all met a self-hating homo, right? We've come across it through a few of them recently, I believe. I think it's all wrapped up together. So it's not about me just pointing and going, there's a gay, as tempting as that would be, but it's kind of saying his writing, his words kind of speak for themselves. This is a man who was clearly wrestling with sexuality in some form. He was connecting with a number of queer men, including Oscar Wilde, and having these very powerful, intimate connections that he clearly felt enormous shame around as well. And then writing a story that was basically based on one of the most famous bisexual people of all time, Lord Byron, by one of his acolytes, John Polidori. So, if we're talking about Dracula, he's taken from the vampire, with a Y, you have to say it weird, vampire, which was based on Lord Byron. So why is he consuming this? What's his connection in this story? And then it's created something where, the vampire has come a long way since Dracula, but it's the start of that flourish, that debonair, that wealthy man living in a castle by himself, the relationship that he has with other men in that book. It's hard not to see a sensuality and a sexuality there, in the sense that a lot of the female characters are almost side characters. They're kind of disposable. So there is it's for me, I think it's a really clear queer reading, because he wrote these letters that I feel are just so brashly queer for the time period. And that anything that, if you say, well, he can't be queer because of his homophobia, that's such a cishet thing to say. It means you don't understand the darkness of self-hating homophobia. It's a complex thing being gay. It's a complex thing being queer. So yeah, I'm going to die on this hill. I'm going to die in this coffin.
But you do give a lot of space in the book for these imperfect figures, these imperfect icons, we might want to say. You have a beautiful metaphor in the introduction that if you grow a flower in the dark, then it will grow pale and crooked and unhealthy, and that we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at queer figures in history. And of course, there's also that difficulty of language and definition of, we can't know how people self-defined or what language was available or anything like that, but I love that you have this compassion for these figures. They don't have to be perfect. Who can ever be perfect?
Yeah, I think, so the flowers in the dark analogy is I think we've got this really broken to become our heroes. Now, some do, and that's wonderful. If you can go through darkness and you can turn it into light, you can learn from something that happens to you, and you can learn to never let that happen to anyone else again. That's wonderful. Most of us, when we're traumatized, we come out with trauma. It doesn't make us wonderful. And so queer people who are living in secret with fear, with self-hatred, imagine being queer in the fucking 1700s, Things are freaking terrible around the world today, but the level of secrecy that some of these people were living in, there is no way you can come out of that unharmed, and also not harming other people. And that doesn't mean we go, oh, bless that person for being a serial killer, or isn't that nice the way that they really abuse people? No, you don't make apologies for someone behaving badly, but you do have to understand where that behaviour comes from, because that is part of the queer story. And if we don't talk about it, it's weaponised and flipped against us, because we're told that we're cutting off the corners. We're doing a Victorian. We're making it nice and palatable, and people will say, well, what about this person who did something awful? What about this Nazi? What about this? And I'd rather go yeah, because we're everywhere. You'll find us in every strata of society doing every behaviour imaginable. We're no worse than any other kind of person, but by God, we're no better either. And understanding some of these really broken, twisted, damaged, complicated characters is also part of the queer story. And I would say, if you like this kind of stuff, I was inspired partly by reading Bad Gays, which is really refreshing in some ways to finally shrug this off and go, we don't always have to be nice anymore. I'm kind of sick of just portraying all the goodies and going like, no, there's a whole cast of queer people, and not all of them behave perfectly, because we don't hold that expectation around cis-het people, but for some reason queer people, we have to behave like storybook characters to be seen as moral heroes, otherwise we're demons, and I think we're neither, really. What kind of demons, but in a fun way. But yeah, I think I want to go to that meaty, complex space. And the same with language. Today I can make lovely jokes about being like, Bram Stoker, what a gay. But the fact is, language is complex and it has changed enormously, and it's changed how we see ourselves. So it is inaccurate just to go, this person was trans, but it is not inaccurate to say this person who lived 600 years ago, their life is so deeply parallel to living people who would describe themselves as trans that we can draw a through line and we get to do that. That's something that is important and I think completely reasonable.
Such a beautiful place for us to move to audience questions, because there is still so much. I'm not even halfway through this book. We still have witches, demons, ghosts, Jack the Ripper, aliens, pirates, superheroes, and robots that we haven't even touched on. This book is so chock-a-block with information. You will find it absolutely fascinating. But I want to make sure we have enough time for your questions. So we do have a roving mic. So if you just put your hand up nice and high and just wait for the mic to get to you, just so that we can all hear you. So, great. We have, you can choose. Oh, sorry, Chris.
We'll see how far this goes.
I actually have two questions, and you can answer the one you like better. The first question is, so often the creatures and characters that we identify are the villains rather than the heroes. Why do you think that is? And the other question is, when we're talking about folklore, often we're doing so from a middle class kind of anthropological background, and often these stories are not middle class. And how do we escape the inherent difficulties of dealing with class and appropriation?
I'm going to try and answer both. So the first one is, like, from my perspective, mythical creatures often are about lessons, they're about teaching. So they're often put in place like either for religious reasons or for children or for a combination of both. They're moral lessons. So the mermaid can be many things. She can be women don't be vain. She can be men don't go to sea, or the sea is dangerous, or women are dangerous. There can be all kinds of things that are wrapped up in very simple terms in a creature. A unicorn is a bad man needs a good woman, all right? There are all these layers to it. So because they're lessons, and lessons are often, don't do that. Whatever you do, this is bad. It's about upholding the structures of society. So because of that, the monsters and the creatures, what they are is that if you do that, then, and if you do that, you'll become, and if you do this, then this one will get you. So wolves or werewolves, in some stories, it's the women don't go into the woods alone because you're asking for it. You know, just to be very clear, I'm using the terms that would be like really broad terms written at the time. For, you know, a mermaid, it might be like that seductive lady is probably evil inside because she's so beautiful. So we find that these creatures often do show a side of darkness because they're being used to teach. To jump onto your second question, like, yeah, 100%. Like at the beginning of the book, I basically say, "Hi, I'm going to fuck this up. Sorry," because I'm a white cis dude from London. And so my experience that I'm drawing from, I can be as academic about it as I want. It's rooted there. The chapters are all grouped around Western or, concepts or constructs of the global north that we understand as being folkloric. Fairies, wolves. If a Japanese writer were to do this, they would do it completely different to what I was doing. But in terms of class, it is really friggin' challenging because folklore, a lot of it is oral history, which means it literally doesn't get written down, right? So the challenge is, the oral history means you're going to get more working class voices, you're going to get more everyday folk, you're going to get more of that real legitimate stuff. But when it gets to me, I've already had it through the filter of the person that went in there and wrote it all in a book, and which ones did they write and which ones didn't they. So I've always tried wherever possible in the book to kind of take the person that's writing it down and what their perspective is, what lens they're looking through it, and what things might have missed out. But the tragic thing is, just like queer history, working class history is the stuff that gets swept off the table and it falls through the cracks. So I'm always going to be doing a far less than ideal job. But if it helps, it's kept me up at night a lot whilst writing the book. It's far from perfect, but it's something that I have been thinking about a hell of a lot. Great question.
I'm going to swap the mics so that I can take the one with lots of lead. Where were you? Yeah. If you had space for one more chapter, which creature would you include and why?
Oh, that's such a good question. Okay, so I actually had a lot of, when I first wrote it, it was like a quarter longer than what it already is, and my lovely editor was like, no, babe, cut it down. And like, you have to kill your darlings. So I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is the idea of really modern folklore. So I'm talking like, this may mean, if some of you are really online, this might mean something, and you might think I've just like had a hemorrhage. Creepypasta. Right? Okay, so some of you, yeah. So creepypasta is like constructed horror stories or anecdotes that are designed to be viral. So they're created, so there's this idea of like, is it true, isn't it true? It's like that Blair Witch Project idea of someone writing a story and then it becomes like the talk of the playground. So like the most famous one probably is Slender Man. And Slender Man has some really dark and fascinating queer connections to it. And I wanted to write a whole thing about like cryptozoology, about creepypastas, about the kind of the really modern folklore, the folklore that we've been generating in the past 15 years. And it is fascinating, but it was also where my editor was like, no, you get to write one book. So yeah, that really irked when I had to remove that, but it's still bubbling away somewhere inside. Thank you.
I think I saw you.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for coming and talking to us. I was wondering, you talk about some of the early creatures and you've explained how the Victorians have sanitized these and kind of turned against queer people. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the queer origins, about how they were tied to queerness before the Victorians got to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's an ancient story. So again, stuck with me, so mermaids is going to be what I'm going to go for. But if we look at some of the earliest accounts of mermaids, so the oldest ones, we're talking like 65,000 years. This is insane. So like the York of like indigenous Australia, Arnhem Land, so some of the early cave paintings will actually show mermaid-like creatures. And they are definitely androgynous in form. But if we fast forward a bit, like a fair bit further, we go to Syria, and we have like the goddess Atargatis, who is often described as a mermaid goddess. It's a bit more complicated than that. But her priestesses were assigned male at birth, self-castrated, and then lived as women. We have this as written accounts at the time. And different people use different pronouns to describe them. And so the symbol of the mermaid, early on, long before Hans Christian Andersen, long before all of that, and the Victorians got like grubby mitts on it, was already this like gender bending creature. There was an association with transformation, your body transforming, you going from one role to another, that was sort of baked in there. And you see a lot of this because a lot of the creatures, if you go far back enough, we're talking about them coming from societies that are pre-Christian, which are, not necessarily monotheistic, where understandings of gender, by the way, they're not like one big Mykonos gay pride parade. I'm not saying like, oh yeah, indigenous people, it's all fine. I'm saying that they have completely different understandings of sexuality and gender to what the Victorians would understand and what we understand here in the West today. And so these creatures are created, these stories are told in societies where there might be man, woman, and something else. Where, in the Māori tradition, the katapui means that you could have a beloved of the same gender. Their so-called, something called the Māori Romeo and Juliet, has the equivalent of Romeo basically breaking up with his boyfriend before going after the equivalent of Juliet, and then his boyfriend helps him because he discovers that the love that they have is so profound, it's beautiful. So a lot of these creatures, they're not forged in Christianity, they're not forged in monotheism with these understandings of sex and gender, and therefore you see a lot more fluidity. And that's one of the reasons why, not just the Victorians, the medieval period, which is an incredibly long period, but during that time, both of those groups of people really went to town to censor because it was uncomfortable looking at the stuff that they were trying to interpret. So yeah, a lot of these creatures have ancient origins that we might describe as queer, and they've gone through rounds of censorship, and it's amazing that here we are today, still like tattooing them on our bodies. Something of it has survived, something of it has still carried through.
Do we have one more in the room? And then I've got one online. We'll do two cheeky ones.
Very quick. I'm only 4 pages in, but it looks very exciting. You talked about when you walked around museums and didn't see yourself. I wonder if you find there's room in kind of deep time items or things that we have no idea what they are, like Stonehenge. It could have been a proto-gay bar. We just don't know. I wonder, do you find space in complete unknowns? And museums are bad at saying what it is and maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I was asked, I did a podcast interview recently, and someone asked me, so how long ago can we see queer representation? I was like, well, how long can you see representation? Because, queer people have been around since the dawn of time because, queerness exists in the animal kingdom, right? It's not like suddenly one day humans became a bit gay. Like, that didn't happen. It's always been there. It is in our DNA, if you want to go into it. It's who we are. So everything you look at, Stonehenge, anywhere, you are fully welcome to project queerness because we were there. We were 100% there. The challenging thing is, sadly, that we have this straight until proven guilty concept in history. The body of evidence that you need to make a proclamation as heterosexual is very weak. You can make loads of jokes about Henry VIII and how he felt about his wives, but if I were to say, prove that he loved them, prove it. How are you going to prove it? I want to see bed sheets. I want to see UV bed sheets, and then I will believe it. People think you're absolutely nuts, right? But if I'm like looking at these two, Egyptian men buried side by side, this is going to go into the classic trope, where they're like, oh, they're brothers, and like, because that makes it okay? They're holding hands. Like, this is... So there is a trickiness where we feel the need, I feel the need as a historian, to have that body of evidence. But in my own self, I now fully believe, I know, that queer people have always been there. So every space, every building, every castle, I'm like, I wonder what the queer people were doing. How was that working its way out? And I think if you go with that mindset, you actually end up becoming a better historian because you see things that other people just look right over. But yeah, it's a challenge. As a historian, I want rigor, I want to give you facts, I want you to leave and go, that was a cool thing, and I can cite it. As a queer person, I'm like, just go to Stonehenge, and why wouldn't it be a gay bar? I love that. Again, I've stolen it, it's mine. Thank you.
Yeah, hi Sasha. I wanted to ask you a bit about whether you mentioned changelings in the book, and I'm wondering whether you'd agree that they could be read as queer. I mean, essentially it's the idea of an imposter, like whether it's the fairies or some other supernatural being that comes and steals your child and then replaces it with an imposter.
Yeah, there's a whole section about changelings.
Okay,
Because you know, one of so changelings are interesting because there's one read which is very much about like one of the classic reads is about neurodiversity, right? So changelings are often described. So a changeling is like a fairy that replaces you or replaces your child. It's one of the fae. And just like witches, people have been burnt or killed for being a changeling. Whole families would turn on individuals for behaving weird. And that behaviour might be obsessively counting something. It might be dressing strange, behaving out of character. So we're talking, this could be anything from autism to schizophrenia, you name it. But then also, yeah, if you were to suddenly be perceived as a man and be wearing, quote, women's clothes, that is just classic changeling behaviour, isn't it? And then if we look at if we look at those transphobic parents who speak about their experiences, the way they talk about their kids is like changelings. It happened all at once. Suddenly my child wasn't mine. They were taken over. The virus, the woke mind virus, took them over, and now they won't speak to me anymore, and they want me to use this strange language. I don't know them, and they won't talk to me. You know, that, for me as a queer person, I have friends who've had that experience where they've basically been described as changelings, as something that's been placed there. It's very dark, and sadly it's never gone away. Even if most of those people aren't saying it's fae or demonic, some of them are. It has a whole paragraph, because you're right, it is a strong connection to make.
I think if we finish with one from online, this one was from Jade, who said, did any of the folklore you studied teach you anything about your own queerness?
Ooh, I mean, yeah, so much. I think this is going to sound like a really strange thing to say, but when I came out and I was like, I'm gay. And I did the classic, like, 16-year-old gay boy thing, which is very cringe. Like, I'm gay, but I'm not, like, gay, right? It's not like my personality. Like, when I see 47-year-old gay men doing this today, I have empathy, but it also makes me cringe, because please stop. But I did that, and then slowly over time, I was like, well, you know, actually I'm gay, and I'm part of the LGBT community, and actually, well, then what does even gay mean? And so I still use the term gay, but every passing year, I want to be really carefully saying less cis, right? Non-binary, like it's somewhere out there's like a guiding star. More bisexual, more fluid, like all of that stuff seems to, every year that I learn and speak to more people, I understand my own sexuality and gender is more amorphous. And I love that, I think it's great. But by researching the book, I started to think, what is even human anymore? And it's really funny because I can remember like my 18-year-old self, like sitting in my first queer theory lecture at York University, and my brain was like, bleh. And I remember leaving and being like, I was a little dick. I was like, this is ridiculous. I mean, come on. Like, it's all simple, right? It's just a bunch of letters, and you choose a letter, and that's what you are. After doing this book, I'm like, I am the universe. I am as old as time itself. I am the people that came before me. So if anything, this book has made me like even more irritating. And like the kind of person the Daily Mail would write an entire article out if they ever got me drunk. So yes, I think the influence has been like seeing the stories of thousands of years. My queerness doesn't just feel like this little thing that exists in me. It now feels like this epic human story that I'm woven into. And I feel kind of like passionate about sharing that and being part of that. That's definitely come from writing that. Yeah. Is it all right if I end with a really quick little reading?
I will return this to Kirsty. and while you find your page, I will just point out, we have books over this side. The signing table is going to be over that side, so if you have a book, you can go straight there. If you need a book, go over there. And the loos are downstairs if you need them afterwards. We're not being rushed out the door, so take your time, ask any questions you didn't get a chance to in the signing queue. And I will
So I wanted to do a little reading. Again, thank you so much for coming. Because, like, let's just face it, we've all got something on our mind at the moment. Like, it's been really shit, and I think a lot of us woke up yesterday. I won't lie, I was surprised. Maybe I shouldn't have been, alright? Maybe I should have known better. But it's scary, and I wanted to end on something that I hope would make you feel a bit powerful and good. So this is towards the end of the book, like towards the conclusion. It's called 5 Magic Beans. And it's basically me just doing that final assertion that I've said over and over in this talk, which is, we've always been there. So maybe this can leave with a bit of positivity. When writing this book, I've occasionally discussed passages with my ever-patient husband, or talked through my current reading research with him. Despite his unwavering support, I'm an incredibly lucky man, he has commented on the darkness of so many of these stories. He is not wrong. Queer history, even when it is about mythology and storytelling, often brings in elements of torture, death, punishment, and suffering. The surviving records are rarely ones of joy or celebration. But there is a way to flip this around. While the way history cements LGBTQ+ experiences is so often based on the worst day of an individual person's life, we can remember that this is just one day. The person lived a life that was full, rich, and complex outside that one gory end or asylum record or sodomy accusation. The upsetting document or anecdote might be how the story has survived until today, but it is not indicative of a real human life that spreads far beyond the text from a court record or a mugshot or a burned love letter. The light that shines down into the oubliette. An oubliette is a dungeon, normally under a castle or keep. The name comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget, as it serves the purpose of keeping a wretched prisoner out of sight and memory. The oubliette of sad and half-forgotten stories is that LGBTQ+ people are not victims any more than they are heroes. They are just people, and people have an indomitable spirit to live, love, fornicate, and express themselves. So we know the same applies to every person, every story, and every fragment. Thank you.
To you for hours and hours and hours. If you don't already have it, buy the book, read the book, get the book signed. You won't regret it. It's brilliant. And thank you so much to everyone for coming, for listening, for your brilliant questions. And thank you, Sasha.
Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Lighthouse Bookshop.